Making sure your investments are set up properly in retirement can make all the difference in the world. For example, let's say you have a $1 million portfolio. We're going to look at two different scenarios. In scenario A, we have a 50% gain in year one and a 50% loss in year two. In scenario B, we have the opposite. Year one, we're going to have a loss of 50% and then a gain of 50% in year two. How does that change things? Well, it's the same outcome. So in scenario A, $1 million, a 50% gain, that brings us to $1.5 million. Year two, we take a loss, that brings us down to $750,000. Scenario B, we had a 50% loss to start out, so $1 million goes to $500,000, and then you have a 50% gain on $500,000. That brings you to $750K. That's just simple math, simple arithmetic. That usually isn't what happens in real life, though. We're usually either contributing to our 401ks, Roth IRAs, brokerage accounts, or we're taking money out. Well, how does that change things? Let's take a peek. So let's say we instead add in $50,000 at the beginning, the end of each year. So we start with $1 million, do a 50% gain, add in $50K, and then we take a 50% loss, and then we add in $50K again. That's going to be scenario A. Scenario B, we're doing the same thing, except we're doing a 50% loss first, and then a 50% gain. Do we have the same outcome like before? Well, we don't. In scenario A, we end up with $825,000. In scenario B, we end up with $50,000 more. Why did we end up with more money in scenario B, even though I just showed you the math was the same? How does it change things when we're adding money in? Well, the reason things are changing is because the order of your returns makes a difference when you're adding money and taking money out. All other things being equal, in the years in which you are adding money to your 401ks, your Roth IRAs, your taxable brokerage accounts, you actually want your losses at the beginning and then your gains on the back half, I guess you could say. And that's demonstrated right here. In scenario A, we actually had our gains first and then our losses. In scenario B, we had our losses first and then our gains. And it was a more favorable outcome because of the fact that your principal is being compounded on the gains on the back end. So what happens in the opposite? What happens when we have $1 million and now we're taking money out? Same thing in scenario A, same thing in scenario B. In scenario A, we've got our gain and then our loss. Scenario B, it's flipped. We have our loss and then our gain. Do you think it's going to be the same outcome as here when we add money in, or do you think it's going to be the same? Well, it turns out it's actually neither of those. You actually want your gains at the beginning and then your losses on the back end when you're taking money out of your accounts. Scenario A ended up with $50,000 more this time, as opposed to scenario B, which ended up with $625,000, as compared to scenario A with $675,000. Why is this important? Well, in the retirement planning world, we call this sequence of return risk, because the sequence or the order of your returns made a difference on the outcome of either of these retirement plans, I guess you could say. The person who had their gains at the beginning and then their losses on the back end actually had a more favorable outcome, all things being equal, as compared to unfavorable scenario B, which ended up with $50,000 less than scenario A. They had their losses first and then their gains. Once again, we call this sequence of return risk because the order of your returns makes a huge difference. And this is really important because the four mistakes that we're talking about today all kind of get back to sequence of return risk. So with that said, mistake number one, that's going to be your investments aren't aligned with your retirement plan. So let's look at another example. We're going to have a $1 million portfolio that has a $50,000 budget. That basically means we're going to take $50,000 out of the account every single year. Well, when I talk about your investments being aligned with your retirement plan, basically we're looking at the mix for most people of stocks versus bonds. Kind of your more growth assets in your stocks and your more fixed income or more kind of safe harbor assets in your bonds. Well, instead of just putting yourself through like a risk tolerance questionnaire or using your age to determine how much you should have in stocks and how much you should have in bonds, I'm a big fan of actually using your retirement plan to dictate how much you should have in stocks and how much you should have in bonds. And that's exactly what we could do here. So instead of having an arbitrary amount of stocks and bonds inside your portfolio, you could actually have something that reflects your retirement plan. So in this case, we have $1 million, but we need 50 grand out of our account every single year to cover our retirement expenses. Well, I could say to myself, I want 5 years of expenses in kind of more our, quote unquote, safe harbor assets, our fixed income every single year. So with that, I could take 50,000 times 5, that's $250,000. Say to myself, I always want about 5 years of expenses in fixed income, just in case the market takes a big dip in the future. I know I have at least 5 years of dry powder ready to go to deploy when it comes to my expenses. Well, that would drive the portfolio being $250,000 in bonds and $750,000 in stocks. You're essentially using your plan to drive how much you have in stocks and bonds inside of your portfolio. And you could do this any number of ways that you feel more comfortable with. If you want to be more conservative, you could have, let's say, 8 years of fixed income worth of expenses. So you have 8 years, $50,000 times 8, that's $400,000, right? Yeah. And then you have $600,000, which would be the rest of your portfolio in stocks. We already went through the 5-year column. Then 3 years, if you want to get a little bit aggressive in your retirement plan, you could have only 3 years of expenses in bonds and then the rest in growth assets. You're essentially trying to shield yourself once again from sequence of return risk. 3 years on the far right-hand column, that's a little aggressive, but hey, if you're comfortable with writing out those big drawdowns, maybe you feel comfortable with that. You want to get more conservative. Hey, now I've got 8 years worth of expenses just in case the market takes a big dip like 2008, or if a 2020, 2022, 2018 situation happens. I'm ready to go, and I've got a lot of bonds ready to go to be deployed for my fixed income to cover my expenses. No right or wrong answer here. It's just what you feel most comfortable with. It's all about making sure you're trying to avoid that sequence of return risk, so you're not having to draw on your growth assets when they inevitably take a little bit of a dip. And that brings up investment mistake number 2, which is a lack of diversification. So you see this a lot with things like large companies. I see a lot of portfolios, retirees that don't have really anything towards small cap companies, mid cap companies, or anything like that, or a home country bias. So this is basically, all of your money is in, United States based companies. I think the United States makes up like 2/3 or a half of all the market cap of the entire world. So it's hard not to have a bias there, but you still could have some diversification in terms of international in developing and emerging markets. And then same thing with highly correlated assets. So just because you have 3 different ETFs or mutual funds in your portfolio, if they're all highly correlated, that's not diversification. Diversification is about having assets in your portfolio that are uncorrelated, because getting back to that sequence of return risk, if you have a moment in time in which, like we're going through here, scenario A and scenario B, let's say in scenario A, you have fund XYZ has a 10% loss, and then fund ABC has a 5% gain. Well, that's great that they're not very correlated. Essentially, when one goes down, the other one is going up. So when we rebalance, we could sell fund ABC and we could put that money into XYZ. Or in scenario A, if we need money out of our accounts, we can sell ABC. We can avoid that sequence of return risk, essentially having to sell our assets when they're down. We could rely on fund ABC, sell that, and put that into our checking account. And then eventually when the markets recover, XYZ is back up, we could sell that, and so on and so forth. When you have assets that are highly correlated, they move in the same direction, like scenario B, you have 2 things that are going down at the same time. Yeah, I mean, you could sell ABC and put some into XYZ. There's a little bit of rebalancing there that you could do, but it's not as highly impactful as scenario A. In scenario B, if you have to take money out of your accounts and the only 2 holdings you have, or all your holdings in your portfolio, are highly correlated, you're going to run into sequence of return risk. Investment mistake number 3, which is holding on for too long. This has to do with concentrated positions. So a large holding or position that takes up your overall portfolio. So a good example here is like, hey, we bought something for $5,000. Now it's worth $50,000. Well, what do we do now? Well, there's like a dozen different things that you could really do in this situation when it comes to managing risk, managing taxes, managing the overall allocation in your portfolio and how this position relates to it. But the whole point of this is like, hey, this investment's already like 10x. Hey, let's just take our winnings and move on essentially and put this into a more diversified portfolio. And when it comes to this investment mistake, holding on for too long, I see folks and they'll see their investment 10x and then maybe the stock won't perform as well moving forward. And this is usually why I don't recommend buying individual positions, because people get really emotionally attached to companies. When it comes to things like, getting back to this right here, when a fund is up or down, you're not really emotionally attached to like a growth fund or an S&P 500 value fund or a mid-cap fund when it's up or it's down. But for some reason, when people see, companies like in this situation, like ABC company that I made up, and it 10x's, you feel like you're kind of like emotionally involved in the company. And for that reason, I always tell people to try to avoid individual positions. And, when you have a big winner, take your winnings and kind of move on. That brings up investment mistake number 4, which is about investments not being located correctly. Notice how I did low capitalized, and that's because allocation versus location. Allocation is kind of like your stock and bond mix overall. Kind of already talked about that. Location is where your stocks and bonds are actually located. So when it comes to location, they could be in your 401k, your pre-tax accounts, they could be in your after-tax accounts, which you pay capital gains on the growth, or they could be in your Roth IRAs, which is your tax-free accounts. Where your stocks and bonds are located, how much you have in each account, I think makes a huge difference when it comes to your overall retirement plan, risk management, your tax plan, just everything overall. So when it comes to this, there are 3 big mistakes when it comes to location that I commonly see. A is going to be bonds inside an account with a long time horizon. I think this is really important because bonds should have a specific use inside of your portfolio. You shouldn't have an arbitrary amount in there like we talked about last time. If you have a long time horizon, why do you have bonds in the portfolio? Yeah, you could have some in there for rebalancing as a ballast when it comes to overall risk management. I get that. But, for example, someone who is 30 years old that has 40% of their overall portfolio in bonds, well, you should be asking yourself why. Especially if this is like in a retirement account that you're not going to touch for, 30 plus years. You should really be thinking about that. Scenario B, tax inefficient investments inside a taxable account. So in your taxable accounts, you have to pay taxes on the growth, and you also have to pay taxes on any, interest or dividends that are paid. So maybe you shouldn't have potentially, dividend paying stocks inside that account, maybe inside of your retirement accounts instead, or a REITs, real estate investment trust. Those pay ordinary income. Those aren't very tax friendly. You just need to be really careful about your taxable brokerage accounts and how much and what type of investments, what allocation you have inside those accounts. And then C, not enough stocks inside of your 401k. If you have your 2 main buckets of money, which a lot of people do, your IRA and your 401k, it sometimes makes sense to have more stocks inside of your 401k because of the fact that you're contributing to that account and you could potentially buy in at low prices. In your IRA, you want to be a little bit more conservative. Overall, maybe you're aiming for like a 70-30 approach where you have 70% stocks, 30% bonds. But that 30% bond approach, maybe you have most of those bonds, if not all of them, inside of your IRA that you're not contributing to, and then the rest split between your IRA and your 401k. So if the market does take a downturn right before retirement, hey, you're good to go because you got all your bonds ready to go. In your IRA, in your 401k, if you're still working and contributing, hey, you're buying in now at lower prices. So that's something to think about as well. The whole point of all this is to just really be intentional on where you're putting your stocks and your bonds. And speaking of being intentional, if you're interested in knowing how you can save money in retirement, check out this video right here, where I show you how you can save money on taxes in retirement. Also, if you want to chat more about your retirement plan, click the link below in the show notes for a complimentary consultation. Thanks. I'll see you there.